Welcome and thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library. My name is Amy Perry and I'm an adult services specialist here at the library. Today's program, Transition and the ADA, is presented by Alexis Popa. Alexis is an education consultant with JAN, the Job Accommodations Network. Please welcome Alexis.
Alrighty, so hello everyone and welcome to today's presentation on the Job Accommodation Network's services for transition in the Americans with Disabilities Act. The plan for today is to share information on Title I of the ADA, transitioning from school to the workplace, going over disability disclosure in the process of requesting accommodations, and lastly, examples of accommodation situations and solutions. So before we jump in, I wanted to share a little bit about myself and the Job Accommodation Network, which we call JAN for short, and the services that we provide. So I am a consultant on the cognitive neurological team. We have a few teams dedicated to helping individuals with disabilities as well as employers, depending upon who contacts us. And we kind of divvy everyone out with different disabilities and their specialty areas. I've been with JAN for in total, a little over 4 years. The last 3 years, I've worked with JAN as a specialist and then quickly moved up to a consultant after a couple months. And then the 1 year before that, I worked as a graduate assistant with the company as well in my master's program. So I've been along the journey with them for a few handful of years. So a little bit about JAN for those who may not be familiar with who we are and what we do. The Job Accommodation Network is the leading source of free, expert, and confidential guidance on workplace accommodations and disability employment issues. So our consultants offer one-on-one guidance on workplace accommodations, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title I specifically, and related legislation such as the Rehabilitation Act. We also provide information on self-employment and entrepreneurship options for people with disabilities. We were established in 1983 as a free national service. We specialize in job accommodations and the employment provisions of the ADA. So consultants can assist callers at any point in the interactive process, from explaining what the process includes to helping pinpoint and solve difficulties at specific steps. We can answer specific questions and give targeted technical assistance, as well as provide comprehensive resources from our site. All calls, emails, chats are confidential, so individuals that reach out can freely explore their options. JAN is very easy to use, and we offer several ways to obtain our assistance anytime and anywhere. So you can get your questions answered by contacting us toll-free with phone calls, and that includes TTY. You can visit our website to find over 200 disability-specific publications. We have a JAN on-demand email service as well that provides customers with individualized email and chat responses to questions about accommodations and ADA. You can connect with JAN through Twitter, Second Life, Facebook, and other social networks as well. And we also deliver training workshops at events sponsored by corporations, organizations, and federal, state, or local governments, as well as webcasts just like today's. So we really work as your partner in the employment and retention of employees with disabilities. So next I'm going to go over a little bit about our JAN teams. So consultants at JAN specialize in specific areas and work on teams, like I was saying a little bit in the beginning. When you call, you'll speak to a program assistant who will direct you to the appropriate team member and team for the specific disability that's involved and the solutions to what you're calling for assistance with. So we have a motor team, and that team assists callers from anywhere from individuals with maybe back, neck, shoulder impairments, leg impairments, as well as other mobility issues such as arthritis, heart conditions, and gastro-related. The sensory team next is a team that works with individuals who maybe have hearing, vision, or speech impairments, as well as allergies, asthma, and other respiratory impairments. The cognitive neurological team, which is what I'm on, we assist callers with mental health impairments such as depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety and panic disorders, as well as learning and intellectual disabilities. We also help with, traumatic brain injuries, ADHD, autism spectrum, you name it. The list kind of goes on and on. And then our entrepreneurship team assists callers who need information and resources on small business and self-employment options. And then lastly, I wanted to speak to, we have an ADA lineup. So that lineup handles more so general questions regarding ADA. If not one sole disability is involved, and more so maybe for questions maybe about policies, parking, or general ADA Title I guidance, which is specifically employment. We do sometimes get questions about public access, education, things like that. And if we're not able to assist with ideas, we certainly refer out to the proper resources that can help. Righty. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about accommodations, so everyone's on the same page here. So reasonable accommodations are modifications made to a job application process, to the work environment, or the way the position is customarily performed that enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform those essential functions of the position. They also enable an employee with a disability to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment as are enjoyed by other similarly situated employees, maybe without disabilities. Righty. So the definition of disability is now very broad and is as follows. So an individual has a disability under the ADA if he or she has a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such impairment. So something to note is that if an impairment is on the EEOC's list of conditions that are virtually always disabilities, then we at JAN encourage, if it's the employer reaching out to get the diagnosis, move on to making the accommodation. And if it's not on the list, then you should consider the following, how limited the employee would be without any mitigating measures, considering how limited the employee is when the impairment is active, or if needed, considering the condition, manner, or duration in which an employee performs a major life activity, which we'll further discuss later when addressing disclosure. So something we tell everyone in general is to remember, since the definition of disability is now quite broad, as an employer, if you're not sure whether an employee has a disability, they should be erring on the side of caution and process those accommodation requests properly. Accommodations are typically not costly, and the benefits usually far outweigh the costs in situations. So next, I wanted to touch base on some of the differences when it comes to the IDEA versus the ADA. Excuse me. So school-age students with a disability receiving education services are entitled to receive services to access a free, appropriate public education as outlined in IDEA. So services are documented within the students' IEPs that we see, which is determined by their IEP team and funded by their local educational agency. Now, when you're transitioning out of high school and into higher education, or let's say workplaces, accommodations can look a bit different. And additionally, there are processes in which you need to establish eligibility. So once a student exits secondary, eligibility for services and supports is determined through the requirements of agencies outside of the school system. So ADA Title I deals with employment, which is what we're going to be highlighting at most throughout this session. The ADA is a federal law that allows qualified individuals with disabilities to request accommodations at work when needed because of limitations associated with that medical impairment. Title I of the ADA prohibits private employers, state or local governments, employment agencies, labor unions, you name it, from discriminating against qualified individuals with disabilities, whether it's in the job application procedures, so pre-employment, hiring, firing, advancement, or compensation, even job trainings, and other terms or conditions and privileges of employment. So the ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees, including those state and local governments, like I discussed. And the ADA's non-discrimination standards also apply to federal sector employees, which fall under Section 501 of the Rehab Act, as amended in its implementing rules. So overall at JAN, we can certainly help individuals who are within their educational endeavors brainstorm ideas of accommodation, as well as discuss the transition into the workplace. However, when it comes to specific higher ed, reasonable accommodation situations should be addressed, we encourage within maybe their Office of Disabilities or Office of Accessibility Services. Um, Overall, under the ADA, there are significant differences in accommodations and how to receive those. So it's the employee or student's responsibility to make it known that they need a change in the workplace or school setting due to a medical condition. And then furthermore, the employer's responsibility to determine if there's a disability involved and accommodations barring any undue hardship, or likewise in higher education, informing professors individually for accommodations. So all of which we'll be highlighting today. Righty. So here at JAN, we really strive to help individuals learn to self-advocate within the workplace. It's important to overall recognize what your own strengths are and maybe not so much weaknesses, but needs are in the workplace and what may need accommodated. So when transitioning into the workplace, individuals need to prepare and get comfortable talking about their disability and accommodation needs to their future employers or colleagues, as as the employer isn't expected to know or assume that there's a disability involved. And finally, understanding ADA rights and responsibilities is what Jan is here to assist with. Righty. So next we're going to dive into disclosure and get the ball rolling. So disclosing a disability is, of course, always a personal decision. Generally speaking, an individual does not have to disclose a disability until an accommodation is needed. So that can be during that application stages. For example, if extra time is needed to maybe work over a pre-employment test, it can be during an interview, such as, let's say the individual needs to make sure the upper floors of an old building maybe are wheelchair accessible. Or it can be at any time during employment when a change in the workplace is needed in order to better perform the job. So it can happen virtually 2 days into a job or 20 years into a job. It really can vary. So sometimes individuals don't know what they will need in an accommodation until they're actually on the job, and that's okay. At other times, something about the job may have changed or the disability has changed or developed, leading to the employee to disclose at that time. So as an individual, you do not have to disclose a disability before being hired to receive accommodations later on. I just wanted to highlight too a little bit on voluntary self-disclosure forms. We sometimes see those being a big topic of question with individuals. They'll see a form during the hiring process that says, I wish to disclose a disability, I don't wish to disclose, or, no comment, things like that. That is specifically a separate basis. That disclosure is more so for the employer measuring individuals that they're hiring that have disclosed disabilities involved for benefits for the employer. In a sense, it's a whole other area, but that doesn't count as the disclosure piece for accommodation. So sometimes we see individuals say, well, I disclosed when I was hired on that form, why don't they know I need disabilities? Or excuse me, accommodations. So that is a little bit different. It's more so for just measuring outcomes for an employer hiring. Righty. So disclosure, this is when an individual, like I said, divulges or gives out specific personal information about their disability. When an individual discloses a disability in an employment situation, they'll most likely need to provide information about the nature of the disability, their limitations involved, or how the disability affects their capacity to learn and or perform the job effectively, and the accommodations that they will need in order to do the job, or if in the hiring process, accommodations that are necessary in order to complete the application process and successfully interview. Now, next, we're going to look at the next slide to see the reasons for disclosure, because there can be a few different ones. So there are three main reasons why an individual would want to disclose. The first and foremost reason to disclose is to ask for job accommodations. So the most prevalent one. The second reason to disclose is to receive benefits or privileges of employment. So the ADA requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations so that employees with disabilities can enjoy those benefits or privileges that are equal to those enjoyed by other individuals, maybe without disabilities in the workplace. So benefits or privileges of employment include, but aren't limited to, for example, employer-sponsored trainings, services like employee assistant programs, credit unions, maybe cafeterias or lounges, using company gymnasiums, auditoriums, transportation, things like that, as well as areas such as parties or other social functions that are being held maybe to celebrate retirements or birthday parties and company outings. So if an employee with a disability needs an accommodation in order to gain access and to have an equal opportunity to participate in these activities, then the employer must provide the accommodation unless they can show a hardship. And then lastly, the third reason to disclose a disability is to explain an unusual circumstance. And throughout these slides, we're going to see a lot of situations and solutions to kind of gauge a more, um, I guess, like realistic approach to looking at situations and how they were handled. Righty, so now let's take a look at some examples of those three reasons to disclose and ask. So here we have an individual who, after graduating from technical school, Joe knew she would need to be accommodated in order to be successful on the job that she had just secured. So she had taken an afternoon courses at the tech center because with the afternoon bus schedule, she was able to consistently attend classes. However, Joe was unable to drive because of her epilepsy. Right. So as a result, Joe requested a flexible schedule because of the need to use public transportation. The employer agreed to allow a flexible schedule on a trial basis. And that's really what we encourage too, is looking at, can something be temporarily or trialed accommodated to kind of see how it pans out and monitor the effectiveness, or if in other situations you're waiting on documentation, things like that. Next, we have an example of benefits or privileges of employment. So we have Steve, who has difficulty attending large meetings in the workplace where he gets distracted by many people being around and a lot of noise, background noise happening. So as a result, the employer was allowing Steve to attend meetings by phone conferencing, which might be necessary to provide him with that same benefit, excuse me, of information gained from the meetings that everyone else had access to, but in a more controlled setting for him. Righty. Now for an unusual circumstance. So we have Suri, who works in a warehouse in Florida. She has had no issues at work until the air conditioning had broken, and she had begun to have difficulty regulating her body temperature. So the need wasn't there until an unusual circumstance appeared, which then in turn required her to disclose the need. So she needs to disclose and ask for the accommodation of a temporary reassignment, maybe to an area that is air conditioned, or potentially looking at taking leave until it can be fixed. Alrighty. So next we're going to look at how does an individual disclose. So the individual must let the employer know that an adjustment or change is needed at work for a reason related to a medical condition. So to request an accommodation, the individual can use plain English. So what that looks like is you may not need to mention the ADA or need to use the phrase reasonable accommodation. Disclosing can be as simple as the employee saying to their employer, hey, I'm having difficulty getting to work on time because of some medications I take to help me sleep. I'd like to talk to you more about that. Some states, such as California, we see they have more stringent guidelines on disclosure. So I'll highlight that in the medical documentation page later on, as well as we hear at times too that employers aren't understanding individuals' requests, maybe. So at times you might consider maybe mentioning ADA more formalized so that it's better understood. It can just kind of vary dependent upon um, training or educational purposes that the employer's been through or not. Um, we always encourage putting everything in writing so that way you have that paper trail. So whether it's an email, sending it to the proper channels, and we'll go through who that may look like in the next few slides. Righty, so the next question usually is who should want to disclose to. So generally an employee should first check their company handbook or their company's like internal website to see if there's maybe a designated individual for the process or documents that are in place already and policies. However, if there's not, you can't seem to find anything, employees can certainly do so either verbally or in writing, and they can reach out to either their employer, the supervisor, an HR rep, or another appropriate person that you may know of, or the supervisor may tell you to, then move up the proper channels to do so. Alrighty, now we're going to dive into documentation of a disability. So medical documentation is not required under federal ADA. However, employers do have the right to request and require this disability related information when asked to provide accommodations for an employee with a disability. So essentially, if the disability isn't known or obvious, then they have that right to ask for the documentation. Righty. So according to the EEOC, and that is who overall enforces ADA laws, they're the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They're also who you would reach out to for any type of complaints or, needing to go through those enforcement channels. So according to them, medical documentation can be requested from an appropriate healthcare or rehab professional. So this means that the provider doesn't always have to be a medical doctor. We sometimes get that question in, and I do want to stress this because we just see a lot of questions, overall surrounding like, does this person sound legit? Do you think this individual should be getting documentation from this professional? It really can vary, and it really boils down to who's appropriate for their healthcare, who's has the best knowledge for them. They've been seeing them for so long, someone that's reliable. So it can get a little gray area, and employers sometimes want to push for, more documentation, or it came from this person rather than that. And we try to stress, if the documentation is sufficient and shows the need and what's involved, then just move forward and process those properly. So the appropriate providers can include, psychiatrists or psychologists, maybe voc rehab professionals or licensed mental health professionals, which can be, therapists, social workers, things like that. Speech therapists, nurses, we see at times too, if someone's has a PCP filling out information, you name it. So I also wanted to add too, when it comes to learning disabilities as well, if an individual has up-to-date documentation from when you were in school, you should, the employer should consider using that as well in support of a request. So since learning disabilities are static and lifelong, generally the testing that was performed, whether it was in high school or at the age of 18, might supplement this. You shouldn't have to provide your whole, IEP plan on it. You can just, highlight the sections that go over, what the limitations are, suggestions, things like that, whether they're related to executive functioning deficits, cognitive, you name it. So in some circumstances, an employer can request updated documentation if there is some sort of change, or, the disability has changed, the needs have changed, whatever that may look like. Righty. So here we have Tim, whose parents were concerned about his admittance to a community college and his ability to be successful beyond the supports provided in high school. They called us at Jan asking about similar accommodations that could be potentially used in his upcoming courses. So as a result, with Jan's assistance, Tim determined that accommodations he received in high school would most likely help him in his college courses, and he received guidance on disclosing his disability and requesting accommodations in college and what documentation he would need to provide. Next, we're going to look over some examples of accommodation solutions. Accommodation solutions can really vary. It can involve purchasing technology or equipment, hiring on a job coach, maybe making a change to the work site, modifying schedules, reassignment, support persons. I can go on and on. There's really endless possibilities. It doesn't just always boil down to the ideas that are straight out of EEOC guidance. So what it really boils down to, though, is what are those limitations of the disability that are involved and what solutions would be most effective for that individual. Everything should always be on a case by case basis in determining this. And also, keeping in mind what wouldn't create a hardship. Even if one accommodation were to pose an issue or hardship, the employer can't provide that. The interactive process and duty to provide accommodations doesn't stop there. There's still the obligation to look towards alternative effective solutions. Righty. So here we have a few examples of products that can be purchased or modified that we've seen. The top left is a task-specific light, and maybe someone with migraines is having difficulty with their overhead fluorescent lighting in their office, and it's not possible for the employer to swap out entirely for the whole office. So maybe that task-specific light and getting their own maybe modified workspace would better assist. Next to the right of that is a stopwatch. This can come in handy for when maybe an individual needs to separate tasks or remember to take breaks and setting those reminders. To the right of that, the very last picture on the top right is a smart pen, which also kind of goes hand in hand with the recorder in the bottom left. They both do the same tasks. They can help maybe play back instructions from a meeting. Someone with memory loss can maybe benefit from this to have those instructions verbally being, repeated thereafter, so that way they have access to them. The second image in the bottom is pretty self-explanatory. It's a wireless headset for hands-free typing. And finally, the far bottom right is a picture of an iPad. But essentially, this is more of a demonstration of the various apps that are out there that can range from anywhere from time management, behavior modification apps, stress reduction, you name it. There's so many applications nowadays. And that's kind of where it comes into play of trialing out what might be most beneficial for you. I also wanted to add too that at Jan, we now have an assistive tech consultant. Her name is Teresa, and she is now dedicated to really honing in on those tech gadgets. So if you have any questions about that, you can certainly reach out to her, or we can get you the proper information on what vendor you would need to reach out to for your assistive tech. We don't go into grave detail at Jan, I will say, about the tech. We have, some basic information. We have a lot of lists of vendors and resources, and it's kind of up to the individual or employer to reach out to them to kind of hone in on those pinpoints of maybe what would work for their certain software versus another software in the workplace. Righty. Let's see. Next slide. So here we have an administrative assistant who is having difficulty with memory, organizing and prioritizing in the workplace, as well as completing work within a timely manner. So as a result, the assistant was accommodated with color-coded checklists, weekly meeting check-ins with her supervisor, as well as a time timer clock to help with timeliness and completing tasks. And that's an example of what it looks like to the left, the time timer. A little tongue twister. Alrighty, so next, another accommodation can involve making the worksite accessible. Some examples can include installing ramps for wheelchair access, automated doors for opening, as well as parking if it's reasonable. Parking is a big situation, and it can get a little hairy, so every situation is very unique when it comes to that. Can be very finicky, so depending upon the situation, you can certainly reach out to us to maybe get some guidance on. Right, so here we have a situation where a parts sorter in a distribution center had difficulty standing for a shift. He only had a 30-minute lunch and short afternoon break, so his work became sloppy in the afternoons due to his fatigue. Righty, so as a solution, the employee was provided with an anti-fatigue mat to help his back and legs while he's standing, as well as a stand lean stool, that allowed him to work in an upright position, however, while resting his body weight onto that padded seat. So even for those job tasks that might seem like you have to be standing all day, I promise you, there's some form of accommodation idea that can probably be implemented to help alleviate those limitations. Alrighty, so next we're going to discuss the topic of job restructuring. So some individuals might be used to getting accommodations that might involve maybe removing functions of tasks within those educational settings. This could look like less work, extended time to get things done, things like that. So when it comes to the workplace, though, employers are not required to remove essential job duties from a position or reduce their performance or conduct standards as an accommodation. They're free to do so if they choose. That's certainly up to the employer if they want to go above and beyond what's required of EEOC guidance. However, employers can look at altering when or how job functions are done that best suit the abilities of the employee. So, job restructuring is another form of accommodation, which may involve reallocating or redistributing the marginal functions of a job. So, those tasks that aren't, key essential job duties. Um, so lowering case workloads or, productivity, things like that might not be required. However, still implementing some accommodations so that way one can meet those expectations is key. So they might just need to do a little bit more digging to really hone in on what alternative ideas might be helpful. And that's what we're here for. So here we have an employer who required that all employees rotate through their job duties, which included time at a customer service window. Bo was an employee with autism and asked to be excused from the window duty because of difficulty interacting with strangers. Alrighty. So as a result, the employer denied Bo's request, stating that rotating to all positions is an essential function. However, the process doesn't stop there. And this is where it's important on the employer's behalf to realize too that if an accommodation is determined as unreasonable, there's still that obligation towards looking at alternative solutions for that employee. So, what is difficult with those interactions? Are they not feeling maybe as prepared for specific questions or have answers readily available? Maybe having something to refer to in writing for any type of questions that they might have difficulty with, having the option to reach out to someone for assistance. If they're feeling overwhelmed, maybe having a modified break schedule, things like that. Righty. So next we're going to discuss the topic of modified schedules and leave. So under the ADA, it might be necessary to consider modifying a schedule as an accommodation for a qualified employee with a disability, provided that there's a disability related need for the schedule change. And of course, that it's reasonable and doesn't create a hardship. So this can include a change in which an employee works, when or how many hours they're working. A shift change can be viewed as a schedule modification. Employers aren't expected, however, though, to create a day or alternative shift position or bump another employee from their shift to create a vacancy unless this is a customary practice. So thus, if there is not an available day or alternative shift position, or the employee does not have the seniority to be placed in a day shift position, then that might not be a feasible accommodation. So also allowing additional breaks or a modified break schedule can be a form of modifying a schedule as an accommodation. And this can include the required working like alternative schedules. So for example, if someone wants to start earlier and end earlier, their disability is somehow limiting them in that way. They can be required to make up time missed during those intermittent breaks throughout the day. So whether that's staying late or working through other like longer breaks or using leave to account for missed time. And this can include taking an hour of PTO or using family and medical leave if applicable. If they are qualified for it, FMLA can be used intermittently as well. Or overall, an employee can be reduced to part-time hours if essentially they can only work part-time. So when a flexible schedule or a modification to an attendance policy is being requested, and that can be maybe a late arrival, intermittent absences, there should be definitely a discussion regarding the parameters of this flexibility. So that way both parties are on board. The employer has the right to determine what is reasonable and the degree of flexibility that is feasible given an individual's position, as well as the impact of the accommodation on their business operations. So it should be very, I know I keep reiterating case by case, but it has to be very, detailed onto how that would affect the business and just really honing into that individual's core duties. The employer can seek information from the employee's healthcare provider, of course, to confirm that the accommodation of a flexible schedule or window of arrival, intermittent leave, you name it, may be needed. So here we have, as an example, as a result of severe anxiety and a driving phobia, Levi has had difficulty getting to work on time. As a result, the employer flexed Levi's schedule in order to accommodate variations in public transportation schedules. And I want to really hone in on that too, because I've seen a lot of employers lately, sometimes it's the topic of the week, I see where they talk about, well, it's not our obligation to make sure someone gets to work. We don't provide transportation, things like that. Whatever the disability may be, EEOC has talked about that employer would need to look at, can they accommodate this, whether it's reassignment to a closer work location, flexing out that start time and as this situation, or telework, even if ultimately the employee can do their job functions in an alternative setting, if possible. Righty. Next, we're going to highlight modifying policies, which kind of goes hand in hand with those modified schedules too. It is a reasonable accommodation to modify a workplace policy when it's necessitated by the individual's disability. So reasonable accommodation only requires that the employer modify that policy for an employee who requires such action because of a disability. So therefore, the employer may continue to apply that policy to all other employees. This can be policies relating to leave, and schedules as well, but not always. And we'll go over a few other examples in the upcoming slides of additional policies. So here we have Jessie, who had anxiety and requests to bring her support dog to work to help with the upsets and stress that happen daily. Righty. As a result, the employer asks for medical documentation that support the request for accommodation. The no animals in the workplace policy was then modified so Jessie could bring her support dog to work. I wanted to highlight a bit too in the service animal area while we're on the topic of this. Title 3 of ADA highlights public access, which talks about service animals. However, Title 1 of employment does not address service animals. So we do see time and time again, whether it's individual or employer, they're like, we've looked up ADA and it talks about this. However, that is just strictly public access. So if you're a customer going into an establishment. When it comes to service or emotional support animals, they're not highlighted. So everything should be handled just as any other accommodation request could be. Sometimes we see individuals, they didn't have medical documentation to obtain their service animal or support animal, but they have that medical documentation that focuses on their disability, and that's the key. So whether there is documentation on the animal or not, the employer would want to focus on that detailed information on the disability, and then they can ask just for demonstration that the animal is well behaved to be in the workplace and have expectations that they are well behaved, properly trained in a sense to be there. Right. Next, let me see here. Another example of accommodations could be providing outside services or supports to employees. So this can be, providing a reader, an interpreter, or a job coach. We even see support persons being an accommodation. And this can be, for example, someone accompanying an individual with a disability to performance meetings during that interactive process, as well as other situations for whether it's needing assistance to understand or remember key points, or even providing comfort during uncomfortable or stressful situations. And support persons can be virtually anyone that is aware of the individual's disability and understands it. Could be a coworker, a friend, a family member, their job coach, even, you name it. Righty. So one example we have is Josh's job coach and employment specialist, Ed, had served him while during the job search, hiring, and his training period. Ed also worked during this time to locate supports for Josh that could be put into place when he exited the workplace. So individuals in the workplace by themselves, job coach might not be there all the time. So Josh's supervisor was pleased that a mentor, which was an older coworker who had befriended Josh, was identified. He'd be able to help Josh in the same way that Ed could, but more so on a long-term basis. because essentially job coaches, they can be pretty consistent, ongoing, but essentially the goal is to not, to have that employee be more, um, what's the word? Independent on the job and looking at other supports too within the workplace. Alrighty, another example that we have is a job applicant for a dog warden position in city government had difficulty reading and could not pass a required written test. So as a result, the employer had provided a reader as an accommodation for that testing. So essentially looking at an alternative format so that way the individual could better, understand the test questions. Righty. So lastly, we are going to go over the topic of reassignment. According to the EEOC, this type of reasonable accommodation is to be provided to an employee who, because of their disability, can no longer perform those essential job functions of their current position, either with or without reasonable accommodations. So they've tried multiple accommodations, they're still not able to provide or perform those job tasks. Or however, too, when both the employer and the employee voluntarily agree that reassignment is preferable to remaining in the current position with reasonable accommodations. So of course, under both circumstances, this accommodation is only required in the absence of undue hardship. So as part of the interactive process of exploring accommodations, reassignment is often considered when, and these are just a list of ideas, an employee can no longer perform their essential functions of their current position with or without accommodation, like I said. An alternative position is more effective in retaining the qualified employee in light of their limitations and ability to perform the job duties. We see sometimes an employee is out on leave of absence and the employer cannot hold their position while out on that entire leave period without incurring a hardship. So when there is a vacant position to which the employee can be reassigned to continue the leave, we see reassignment there. And just to touch on that too, when leave is finished, that employee would then return to the new position that they were reassigned to carry out that leave. And then lastly, the location where work is performed is maybe causing a workplace related barrier due to the limitations affecting maybe an employee's commute or access to specialized healthcare. We sometimes see reassignment. So this accommodation involves moving an employee to a vacant position that is equivalent in terms of their pay and status, so long as they're qualified. So they don't have to get the employee qualified for the job. It's essentially a vacant position that the individual must be already qualified for. So if there is no vacant equivalent position, then an employer can consider reassigning an employee to a vacant lower level position for which they're also qualified, just essentially to maintain employment. So if nothing's essentially equal, then you would look towards lower level positions. But yeah. Oh, I wanted to add in too, since I don't have it on here, about leave. FMLA has its protections in place. ADA is essentially like any other accommodation based upon the burden of undue hardship. So there's no time frame and how much leave can be provided. It's really based upon overall breakdown of a case-by-case basis and how leave will affect the employer and that position not being filled. So it's very technical and boils down to what's reasonable. So sometimes we see people on FMLA, they need months more in advance too on ADA leave once that FMLA expires. And that's where an employer can kind of assess the situation, see what's reasonable. Sometimes we see people that only need an extra week after FMLA. An employer can look at ADA leave and determine if it's reasonable as well. ADA leave can be used in conjunction with the employer's other leave policies, so short-term disability, long-term disability. It's really up to them to kind of the employer to kind of hone in and see how it interacts and interplays with their policies. Most of the time we see employers using that accrued PTO or sick time towards ADA leave and then going into unpaid leave once those have expired if more leave is still needed. Alrighty, so the last situation we have is a cashier who has experienced extreme difficulty counting back change accurately and once the automatic change counter was removed from the register. So as a result, when no effective accommodation could be provided, the employee was reassigned to a deli position where they would not have to handle money and incur those limitations per se. Righty. And lastly, this is our slide with all of our contact information you'll find. Like I said, you can call, you can chat us and email us, even if you chat after hours. Our business hours are from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Monday through Friday. Even if it's after hours, during holidays, you name it, you can leave a message on any of those contacts and someone will get back to you as quickly as possible.
Okay. And we have another question. What are
Okay.
the benefits for employers who hire individuals with disabilities?
I like to think of it as not a weakness, but a strength. Someone is qualified for that job. And I mean, in today's day and age, it's very hard to come by someone that does not have a disability, whether it's a disability that's in remission. I mean, I can't remember the statistics, but I know it's like one in very few of people have, a disability. And so we really just, I guess, really like to help individuals advocate for themselves or others. We talk to family members all the time that are really trying to, help their loved ones because essentially they are qualified to do the job and they just need some form of accommodation to, enable them. And we do see in the workplace where the benefits far outweigh the costs of an accommodation. We have a great publication on that as well on our site. But kind of like I was touching on too, the voluntary disclosure form that we sometimes see with like federal employers or contractors, employers can get additional benefits as well through those type of programs. But yeah, I think in today's day and age, coming across someone that doesn't have a disability is quite rare. So it's very normalized and not, it shouldn't be problematic or an issue. And essentially, the benefits outweigh it too, because you have someone that's hired on, has been doing the job, they're trained to do it efficiently. And the cost that an employer can incur of going through that whole process of rehiring someone on, training them, things like that, when a very low cost, sometimes not costly at all. So many things are free nowadays, or you have other state agencies that provide it at little to no costs, can enable that in person and not have to reinvent the wheel and hire someone else on. I wanted to add too, EEOC guidance talks about tax incentives and tax reductions for accommodations, or even looking to those state voc rehab agencies or assistive tech programs for states. They'll essentially, most of the time, if not pay the costs associated with it, or you can get tax deductions too. So it's basically a win-win in keeping someone employed that is qualified. And even if qualification standards are questioned in some situations, looking at those alternative options of reassignment, things like that.
And so, Alexis, thank you again for sharing this information with us and taking time out of your busy schedule. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. Like I said, if you have any other questions, certainly give us a shout. We'd be glad to help. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.